Thank you for coming along to watch this brief introduction to the topic of modern slavery. My name is Richard Piotrovich, and I'm a professor of law at Aberystwyth University. I've been there for quite some time. And one of my main research interests is human rights, but more particularly what we might call migration law, and even more particularly, the law relating to modern slavery or human trafficking. And I've picked this topic because I think it can be of substantial interest to you, even if you're not planning to study law, and I'm a lawyer, because human trafficking or modern slavery, and I'll explain more carefully in a moment what that is a topic that brings in many, many areas of study. It includes law, politics, medicine, social work, human rights, history, geography, criminology, a vast array of possible subjects. And that's why I hope it will be of interest to you, no matter what area you're hoping to study at university. Now, what do I mean when I talk about modern slavery or human trafficking? I'm talking about the crime of taking somebody from one place to another in order to exploit them, whether for labour exploitation or sexual exploitation. You might, for example, have heard about county lines. This is the process by which young people, mostly British young people, teenagers, are used to take drugs from bigger urban centres to smaller towns on the coasts and so on. For example, they come to my town, Aberystwyth, from Birmingham, in order to sell those drugs. And most of those young people who are doing this, maybe even all of them, are being exploited, and they've been trafficked for this purpose. They're controlled by people who deny them their freedom of movement and deny them their freedom of choice. So this is a very, very big subject, both in the UK and in every other country in the world. And what I want to do in this next 10 minutes or so is to explain a bit about what exactly we mean in a bit more detail by modern slavery or human trafficking, and then to leave you with some questions which I hope you will be able to think about, and we can discuss them when we have the seminar on the 18th of this month. So let me come back again to what I mean by this issue of human trafficking or modern slavery. You'll have heard the term slavery before, I'm sure. And most people, if you ask them, what do you understand by the term slavery? They will think of somebody who's been held in chains, who has no freedom to go anywhere, who is viciously exploited all the time, and they have no real independence or free agency. And you would be right, but only to some extent, because modern slavery or human trafficking is much more invidious and much more widespread than that. For instance, if you see somebody operating a hand car wash, and there are many of those throughout the UK now, and they'll offer it for £5 or £6, you have to ask yourself, under what conditions are those people, they're usually young men, under what conditions are they working there? Do they have a choice? Are they being forced to do it? And I will come to other examples. So when we talk about modern slavery or human trafficking, I'm thinking about two main types of exploitation. First of all, people are moved, but for what? It's either for sexual exploitation or for labour exploitation. And when I first started working in this area quite a while ago, in the European context, most human trafficking, as far as people were aware, involved the trafficking of young women from Eastern Europe to Western Europe for the purposes of sexual exploitation. And there's no doubt that this was happening on a big scale and still is happening. But what you have to understand is that there's an awful lot of trafficking taking place within the UK, including young British women being trafficked for sexual exploitation. But also, and this is what is quite important to understand, there are other types of exploitation, labour exploitation. For instance, people who are trafficked to work on farms in agricultural labour, people who are trafficked to work in sweatshops, people who have even been trafficked for their human organs to be transplanted. So it's a very, very perfidious and pervasive crime, and it exists everywhere. Now, just to give you some examples, maybe to illustrate this, and to let you see how it can be relevant to your own daily lives. I'm sure you have seen some people begging on the streets in whichever town or city you live in. Now, what you have to ask yourself, is that person begging because she or he really needs the money themselves? Or are they begging because they've been forced to do it by somebody who's controlling them and will take their money? And I saw a good example of this in my own town, Aberystwyth, which is a very small town. Normally, there's just one person begging on the main street outside W.H. Smith's. A couple of years ago, in the week before Christmas, suddenly there appeared about 7 or 8 people all begging on the same street. And at first, it did not dawn on me why this was happening. And then I realized, of course, these people had been brought in a bus, in a minibus, by people who were controlling them, who were given a mandate or an order to collect money, to beg for money in the week before Christmas, when people are maybe feeling more generous and they give to people who are less fortunate than themselves. And you can be sure that those people did not get to keep that money. So that's an example which you might have seen yourself. So think about, if you see somebody begging in the street, that person may well be very unfortunate. Well, they're all unfortunate, but they may be begging just for themselves, or maybe they're being forced to do it. I mentioned hand car washes, which is notorious in this country. But think about something else. When you go shopping in the supermarket, let's say you buy a mango, and most of the mangoes in this country come from East Africa or South America. And you can buy a mango for £1 or 90 pence. And you ask yourself, how do they manage to grow and harvest and ship and store and distribute and then put on display all those fruits for £1 or less each? And it may be that everything is being done normally, but it may be that it is being done through exploited labour. And this is something that you need to think about. Now, of course, if you only want to buy ethically sourced food, it is almost impossible because you cannot trace the derivation or the origins of all the food that you eat. But most people are even unaware that this is happening. And we know that there is significant exploitation taking place in many parts of the world on massive farms which are growing food and flowers for export to Europe and North America. Think about the clothes you're wearing as you listen to this. Are you wearing anything from H&M or Mango or Zara or any of the other big chains or even the smaller ones? And look at the labels where they're made. They're made probably in Eastern Asia or in Thailand, sometimes maybe in Turkey or Sri Lanka. My question to you is here, are you aware of the conditions under which these clothes were produced? How can Primark sell a t-shirt for £4 or £5? Now, I'm not saying that everything from these shops is produced by exploited labour, but there's a real chance, and we have evidence for it, that some of it is. These are people who have been trafficked and forced to work in very difficult conditions. And the question for you is, when you buy something, do you want to wear something? Do you want to buy something which has been produced by somebody who has been exploited? And of course, everybody will say, of course they don't want to buy it, but you cannot tell in most cases. That's a real problem. Now, let me come to a topic which will be close to the hearts of every one of you, smartphones. I'm sure if we were all here in a room and asked you to put up your hand, if you don't have a smartphone, not a single hand would go up. We all have smartphones. We probably can't live without them. And they bring us amazing convenience. They bring us amazing opportunities that were unthinkable even maybe 10 years ago. But where do the components for the smartphones come from, in particular the precious metals? Smartphone batteries can't operate without a component, if you can call that, a metal called cadmium, cadmium. You can Google it. Without cadmium, we wouldn't have smartphone batteries. Without batteries, our smartphones wouldn't work. Most, not all, but most of the cadmium in the world comes from a massive country in the middle of Africa called Congo, the Democratic Republic of Congo, where there have been wars going on for almost non-stop for the last 40 years or so. And we know for a fact that most of the cadmium in the world comes from Congo, and an awful lot of it is produced through exploited labor, trafficked labor. Now, you may not want to buy a phone with a battery which has been produced partly with exploited labor, but bluntly, it's probably impossible to have a smartphone without using that component. So you have to ask yourself, so what am I going to do? Am I going to give up my smartphone? I can just imagine your response to that particular suggestion. You might as well offer to stop breathing as give up your smartphone, I suspect. Now, I'm not being critical of anybody for having a smartphone. I've got one too. We all have one. We can't live without them. But does that mean that we have to go along with the fact that they are produced using components which in many cases have been produced through exploited and trafficked labour. The work that I do looks at the legal aspects of this issue of human trafficking, but there are many other aspects, as I explained earlier. It's an issue of migration because some people are trafficked from one country to another. It's an issue of criminal law, whether people who, not just the people who are trafficked, that they're victims of a crime, but first time sometimes they're forced to commit a crime, for example, to transport drugs and sell drugs. Should trafficked people, and I would like you to think about this, if you've been trafficked for sexual exploitation or labour exploitation, let us say that you've been trafficked, you've been forced to operate in county lines to distribute drugs to smaller towns, and you're caught by the police. Should you be penalised for what clearly is an offence, but an offence that you've been forced to commit? Because is it really your fault? That's something that you need to think about. So there are a number of questions, and I'm going to finish in a couple of minutes, but I want to make one more point and then leave you with a few questions. The one final point I want to make is this. If you watch the mass media, you'll hear often about trafficking of human beings and smuggling of human beings as if they're the same thing. Rishi Sunak said he wants to stop the traffickers and the smugglers sending the small boats across the English Channel. The small boats. If you've been watching the news in the last year, you must have heard about the small boats. Now, smuggling and trafficking are two different things. If I want to get from France to UK and I can't do so legally, I might pay somebody to smuggle me across in a small boat. Now, it's kind of exploitative, but I agree to enter into that kind of deal or contract. That's different from trafficking, where I don't give consent to the exploitation that I'm going to suffer. So there's a difference between trafficking and smuggling. Of course, one of the problems is that people who are being smuggled on boats may think that they're just being taken to their destination, but in fact, when they get there, they find they've been trafficked because they're not free to go. They're forced to work on a farm or in a brothel or something like that. So do bear that in mind. Now, I want to finish off with a few questions, which I hope that you might think about and that we can discuss when we have the seminar on I think it's the 18th in 10 days' time. First of all, I would like you to think about examples or types of exploitation. I've mentioned some already, like county lines and sexual exploitation. Then I would also, related to this, I would like to ask you to think about how or why do some people end up being exploited? How or why do they end up in situations of modern slavery? How is it that some people are trafficked but others are not trafficked? What are the reasons for that? Is it poverty? Is it war? Whatever it might be. But please do think about that. We can have a chat about that. And then another second question would be, how might somebody who's being smuggled, for example, across the Mediterranean from Libya to Italy, or across the English Channel from France to the UK, how might such a person who's being smuggled actually end up being trafficked in the end? In other words, being exploited either in sexual exploitation or labour exploitation. The third question I would like to, don't worry, only a couple more. The third question I raised just for you to think about would be, should a young person forced into moving drugs, in other words, what we call county lines, be penalised if they're caught? And then, fourth question, imagine a young woman is trafficked, or a young man, but it's usually young women, they're trafficked from country X to the UK and subjected to sexual exploitation. In other words, forced prostitution. One day, in order to escape, she stabs the person exploiting her in order to get away. Should she be prosecuted for having stabbed that person? And then, final question, imagine a foreigner person trafficked from any other country, it doesn't matter, they're trafficked to the UK for sexual or labour exploitation, and they manage to escape from that situation, or they're freed from that situation. Should they have to return to their home country? Or can you think of any circumstances when they might be or should be permitted to remain in the UK? So these are the few questions I would like you to think about. And I would like to finish with one slide, if you can bear with me just half a minute or 1 minute more. I'm hopefully going to share my screen with you now. What you see there is a postcard. It's a postcard that I picked up in Lithuania quite a long time ago. And if you can see it, I hope you can see it clearly enough. This postcard was produced by a Lithuanian NGO plus an organisation called the International Organisation for Migration, and their job was to raise awareness amongst young women of the risks of being trafficked for sexual exploitation in Western Europe. If you can see it properly, what it looks like is it's like a young woman who's been held almost like a puppet. She's on strings. So this was a postcard designed to raise awareness. The question I would like to leave with you, and I will come back to this in 10 days' time, is let's say you've got a small budget, you're working for this Lithuanian NGO, and you want to, as effectively as possible, raise awareness of the risks of being trafficked for sexual exploitation in Western Europe. Let's say you've got about 4,000 or 5,000 of these postcards to distribute. Where would you leave them in order to achieve the maximum impact? And by maximum impact, I mean reaching your target audience, which is young Lithuanian women at risk of being trafficked to Western Europe for sexual exploitation. We can have a chat about this. I hope that you'll turn up for the session in 10 days' time. I'd like to thank you very much for your attention. I hope that you have found it interesting. I also hope that if you have any questions when I run this seminar in 10 days, I hope that you will feel free to raise those questions with me, either orally or in the chat. So once again, thank you for your attention, and I hope you found it interesting. Bye-bye.